Karoline Leavitt had always been a fighter. From the moment she stepped into the public eye, she carried herself with an air of confidence that few could shake. She was young, determined, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. It was no surprise, then, that when whispers of corruption began to swirl through the corridors of power, she took it upon herself to uncover the truth. The system was supposed to work for the people, and if it had been compromised, she intended to make sure it was exposed. The investigation started small, just a few inconsistencies that didn't add up. She noticed patterns in cases that had been dismissed without explanation, rulings that seemed to favor certain individuals, and decisions that contradicted established law. At first, it was nothing more than a collection of oddities, but the deeper she looked, the clearer the picture became. There was a pattern, a design behind the chaos, and it all led back to a single point of influence. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she sought out those who had been affected, people who had been wronged, whose voices had been silenced, whose lives had been altered by decisions that defied reason. What she found was a trail of injustice, a long list of individuals who had been forced to accept outcomes that were neither fair nor lawful. Some had tried to fight back, but their efforts had been buried beneath bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. Leavitt knew that if she was going to bring this to light, she needed more than just testimonies. She needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable, evidence that could not be ignored. So she dug deeper. She spent nights combing through documents, analyzing case files, and following leads that others had overlooked. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became that something was terribly wrong. She found financial transactions that raised questions, connections that hinted at undue influence, and communications that suggested decisions were being made for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. She built a case piece by piece, ensuring that every fact was verified, every claim backed by concrete evidence. She wasn't going to allow this to be dismissed as speculation or hearsay. But exposing corruption was never simple. The closer she got to the truth, the more resistance she faced. Roadblocks appeared in places where there had been none before. Files that should have been easily accessible became mysteriously unavailable. People she had spoken to suddenly became hesitant, fearful of the repercussions. She understood their fear. After all, challenging power was never without risk. Despite the obstacles, she pressed on. She refused to be intimidated, refused to back down. She took every setback as a sign that she was getting closer, that she was on the right track. The pushback only strengthened her resolve. She had seen too much to walk away now. Finally, she had everything she needed. The evidence was overwhelming, the facts indisputable. It was time to bring everything to light. She wasn't just going to make accusations. She was going to present the truth in a way that no one could deny. It wasn't just about one person or one case. It was about the integrity of the entire system. With her case fully prepared, she stepped forward, ready to reveal everything. She knew that what she was about to do would shake the foundations of power, but that was exactly why it had to be done. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, every eye fixed on the unfolding events. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of duty, but a few were there because they knew something significant was about to happen. Karoline Leavitt stood, at the center of it all, unwavering, despite the mounting tension in the air. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, collecting evidence, gathering testimonies, and ensuring that the truth could not be denied. From the very beginning, it was clear that the proceedings would not be ordinary. There was an effort to steer the narrative, to turn the focus away from the real issues at hand. Words were carefully chosen, questions were strategically framed, and a tone of superiority dripped from each statement that was directed at her. It was an attempt to discredit her, to paint her as inexperienced, reckless, or even dishonest. She recognized the tactic immediately. It wasn't the first time she had seen someone in power try to manipulate a situation to their advantage. They spoke as though they were educating her, as though she hadn't spent months meticulously uncovering the corruption she was there to expose. Every sentence was designed to undermine her credibility, to make the audience doubt her words before she had even presented her case. But she did not waver. She met every condescending remark with calm determination. If they tried to twist her words, she clarified them with precision. If they interrupted her, she waited patiently before continuing. And when they attempted to mock her findings, she presented them with such undeniable clarity that even those who had come in skeptical began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that this was not just an attempt to challenge her arguments. It was an attempt to publicly humiliate her. They wanted to make an example of her, to show others what happened when someone dared to question the system. The goal was to shame her, to make her regret ever stepping forward. But they underestimated her. Karoline had not come unprepared. She had anticipated resistance, expected hostility, and had armored herself against it. She had studied the cases, memorized the facts, and fortified herself with irrefutable truth. So, when another belittling remark was thrown her way, she didn't respond with anger or frustration. She responded with evidence. A hush fell over the courtroom as she laid out document after document, testimony after testimony, each one revealing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. People who had once scoffed at her determination were now glancing at one another, whispering, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The carefully crafted attempts to shame her were unraveling, exposed, as desperate distractions from the real issue at hand. Still, they tried to regain control. They attempted to dismiss the documents as misinterpretations, claimed the testimonies were unreliable, but Karoline remained steadfast. For every weak rebuttal, she had a stronger response. For every dismissive remark, she had a pointed fact. The courtroom, once leaning in the other direction, was now entirely in her favor. The tension was palpable. The effort to publicly shame her had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting her, they had given her the perfect stage to expose the very corruption she had come to fight. And as she continued to speak, as she presented each damning piece of evidence, it became clear to everyone watching, she was winning. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls of the courtroom, thick with anticipation and silent tension. Karoline Leavitt had waited for this opportunity, had worked tirelessly to ensure that when the time came, the truth would be undeniable. She stood at the center of it all, a collection of documents stacked neatly before her, each page carrying the weight of months of investigation. The room was filled with spectators, some expecting a spectacle, others desperate for justice. She took a breath, steadying herself. There was no need for theatrics, no need for grand speeches. The facts were enough. With a calm, unwavering voice, she began to present her case. The first piece of evidence was a series of financial records. The numbers were clear, the transactions unmistakable. They told a story of favors exchanged in silence, of money moving through accounts in ways that defied ethical standards. It was not speculation. It was documented, verifiable, and damning. Next came the testimonies. One by one, she introduced voices that had long been ignored, individuals who had been silenced by fear or dismissed by the very system that should have protected them. These were people who had lost everything, who had seen justice twisted before their eyes. Some had fought back and been met with threats, while others had been forced into quiet resignation, knowing their words would never carry weight against a system designed to keep them powerless. She played recordings, presented written statements, and displayed official documents that painted an unmistakable picture of wrongdoing. Every new revelation sent a ripple through the room. What had once seemed like scattered complaints now formed a single, cohesive narrative, one of manipulation, deceit, and the betrayal of the very principles that the law was meant to uphold. Despite the overwhelming evidence, resistance was inevitable. Attempts were made to discredit her findings, to suggest that the documents had been misinterpreted, that the testimonies were unreliable, that the numbers did not mean what they clearly showed. But Karoline had prepared for this. She had anticipated the counter-arguments and had meticulously ensured that each piece of evidence was airtight. For every challenge, she had an answer. For every dismissal, she had undeniable proof. The room, once filled with whispered doubts, now sat in stunned silence. Even those who had initially questioned her credibility were forced to reconsider. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation, louder than any defense. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. As she continued, The weight of her words became inescapable. The case was no longer about suspicions or allegations, it was about facts, and facts could not be ignored. The very foundation of trust that had once seemed unshakable was now crumbling beneath the pressure of undeniable reality. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting the evidence speak for itself. There was no need to drive the point further. The truth was in the open now, exposed for all to witness. And no matter how hard anyone tried to deny it, the reality could not be erased. The courtroom had descended into a heavy silence, the kind that only comes when the inevitable can no longer be ignored. Every eye was fixed on the moment unfolding, the weight of justice pressing down on the space like an unseen force. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, her presence unwavering as the final pieces of her case fell into place. There had been pushback, desperate attempts to deflect and dismiss, but the evidence had spoken louder than any excuse. A rustling of movement disrupted the stillness as uniformed officers entered the room, their expressions unreadable, their purpose undeniable. Their arrival sent a ripple through the crowd, some murmuring in hushed tones, others exchanging glances filled with knowing. There was no more room for denial, no more space for arguments. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Steps echoed across the polished floor as the officers approached, their measured movements a stark contrast to the tension thick in the air. No words were needed. The documents had already said everything. The truth had been laid bare, and the law had been set into motion. What had begun as a spectacle meant to discredit Karoline had instead turned into a moment of accountability. The sound of handcuffs snapping into place rang out like a gavel striking its final verdict. A collective breath seemed to hold in the room, then release all at once as realization set in. Those who had come expecting a different outcome, perhaps one where power shielded itself from consequence, were forced to confront a truth that could no longer be buried. As the officers carried out their duty, the weight of the situation settled in. The tables had turned completely. What had started as an attempt to undermine Karoline had resulted in something far greater, an unshakable victory for truth. The public had seen everything. The attempts to shame her, to diminish her findings, to twist the narrative, it had all collapsed under the strength of undeniable proof. The room, once filled with skepticism, now carried a different energy. Some sat in quiet reflection, others whispered among themselves, recounting the exact moment when everything had shifted. For those who had doubted her, there was no longer space for uncertainty. The system had been tested, and for once, it had done what it was meant to do. The officers led the way through the doors, their presence a reminder that no one, no matter how high their position, could stand above the truth forever. The murmurs in the courtroom grew as the weight of the moment settled into collective memory. It was a scene no one would forget, a reminder that justice, when pursued with relentless determination, could still prevail. The events that unfolded in that courtroom would be remembered for years to come. It was not just about a single case or a single person. It was about something much larger. It was about the power of truth, the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced, and the undeniable force of justice when wielded by those with the courage to stand against corruption. Karoline Leavitt had walked into that courtroom knowing what she was up against. She had anticipated the resistance, the attempts to discredit her, and the sheer force of those who sought to bury the truth. But she had also come prepared. She had armed herself with evidence, fortified herself with facts, and carried with her the unwavering belief that justice could still be served. She had stood before those who doubted her and delivered a case, so undeniable that even the most skeptical were forced to acknowledge its weight. Every document, every testimony, every financial record had come together to paint a picture that could not be ignored. The attempts to shame her had crumbled under the sheer force of reality. What was meant to be an attack on her credibility had instead become the very moment that proved her right. When the officers entered the room and placed the handcuffs around the wrists of the one who had wielded power with impunity for too long, it was not just an arrest, it was a statement. It was a message that corruption, no matter how deeply rooted, could still be exposed. It was a reminder that no position, no title, no influence was enough to shield someone from the consequences of their actions forever. The reaction in the room was mixed. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to fully process what they had just witnessed. Others whispered among themselves, replaying the moment over and over in their minds, as if trying to etch it into their memories. And then there were those who had known all along, those who had been wronged, who had suffered under the weight of injustice, who had been forced to remain silent for fear of retribution. For them, this was not just an arrest. It was validation. It was the proof they had waited for, the confirmation that their struggles had not been in vain. As Karoline stood in the aftermath of it all, she did not gloat, did not celebrate in triumph. She simply remained steady, knowing that this victory was not just hers. It belonged to every person who had been silenced. It belonged to every individual who had been told that speaking out was pointless. It belonged to the very idea that justice, when pursued with enough determination, could still prevail. The case had been won, but the fight was far from over. Corruption did not disappear overnight, and the battle for truth was never truly finished. But on this day, in this courtroom, one undeniable truth had been made clear. No matter how deeply hidden, no matter how fiercely protected, the truth would always find a way to rise.